Can I bend your ear a minute?
Let's change the subject.
Didn't know you belonged here.
Many of whom will not be enjoying ribs this afternoon.
This is why I don't have a TV.
I don't know why I never brought him up.
It goes along for a while, and then it takes a turn and ends up exactly where you thought it was going.
But wait, there's more.
I have $150.
We had an interesting idea.
You're in their country. Learn to speak the language.
It's about how they want to be seen by us.
Welcome to Mad Men Men, the weekly show where we discuss a show that used to come out weekly. Each week, we take a close look at an episode of the AMC series Mad Men, which ran from 2007 to 2015, gearing our conversation around the conversation the show is having, mostly about, well, mirrors, and the mirrors of mirrors. Now, of course, I have somebody here who he's an impressive person, and legend has it that he currently has $150. It's Will Ashton.
Hello.
Unfortunately, there is a podcaster who won't be enjoying Mad Men Men with us or eating ribs, and that is Mike Overholtz. He wasn't able to record with us today, but he sends his best regards. And so, for now, Will Ashton, if you could stand up, and we'll all applaud you while you look uncomfortable.
Oh boy. Yeah, I don't really like public displays of affection, so that would be a very uncomfortable moment for me if I was in Dawn's shoes.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're being clapped for like something you didn't really do, or like a situation in which you accidentally killed someone. But you know, to each their own tour of duty, I suppose. So Will, we're talking about another episode of Mad Men. We are almost halfway through season 2.
Yep.
Checking in. You weren't here for last week's episode, right? Or, maybe am I mixing that up? Were you here?
I think I was here. The only one I've missed, so far as I can recall, is Flight 1.
Okay. So we did talk about the new girl.
I thought I was there for it. I could be wrong.
Well, it's tough because I edit these episodes, and so I have it in my head that it was just me and Mike, but I might just be thinking of Flight 1. So
I was going to say,
I know could be the situation.
At the time we are recording this, we're recording this episode that it is just out, and you just worked on it as an editor. So that's probably why it is fresh on your mind.
Yeah, probably. I am vaguely starting to remember now. It was the three of us because we were talking about the ratings and everything that you and I had talked about the week before. So, okay, yes, Will, you were there. I actually, you know what? I do remember because we all said around the podcast table why Will Ashton can't have salt, because we love him. But yeah, that lie aside, Will, how are you feeling about season 2 at this point? Now that we're about halfway, a lot has happened. We're still kind of in a mode, right, of some more setup, building upon previous episodes, but where are you at?
I feel like similar to last week, I don't know if I really talked about this a lot. With this season, I feel like when I watch the episodes, I'm enjoying them fine, but they don't hit me as hard as first season does. But when I reflect on them and read about these episodes, I tend to respect them a little bit more. I think I'm keener on the first season overall, at least at this point. But I think I admire the richness that kind of goes into them and the fact they're making some kind of bold and uncompromising choices this time around. Not that they didn't the first season, but I feel like you can tell that Weiner and company are a little bit more emboldened, willing to make some kind of risky and challenging decisions for the characters that they've just established. And yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely stuff to appreciate and admire here, and we're going to talk about this episode pretty soon. But yeah, I'm a fan of season 2, but I can see why this one doesn't live up to the first season in your view.
Right. I've said it too many times to count at this point that I've always been pretty low on season 2. It's probably my least favorite season, and I've been reluctant to say it's my least favorite because I have a feeling that because we're slowed down and we're not just binging these episodes, that I might notice things maybe in season 3 and 4 that I didn't before, because those ones I binged, and I didn't start watching the show weekly until season... actually, I did start watching weekly in season 4, but not the whole thing, and then I binged part of it. And, I kind of went back and forth because it was a busy time for me. But anyway, Maidenform is such an interesting episode. Now, this one was directed by Phil Abraham. He is brought back because, he's been a DP for the show, I believe, for a bunch of episodes, but I believe this is his first time directing since the Hobo Code.
No, I
it's been
thought
a while.
Didn't he direct Flight 1?
No, Flight 1 was directed by Andrew Bernstein, but I think he did work on Flight 1.
Oh, wait. Okay. Does Andrew Bernstein do the next one?
Yes.
Okay, that's what
Andrew Bernstein did the Gold Violin, which we'll talk about next week.
Okay. That's where I'm getting confused. Sorry about that.
Okay. Yeah, Phil Abraham, I think he worked... Did he work on some Sopranos stuff too, or am I making that up?
He was the main cinematographer for Sopranos, and he directed one episode in the final season for Sopranos, and then I think he directed at least one episode in season 1, but he was the main cinematographer for the season. I know he was the cinematographer for the pilot at the very least, so
yes,
he definitely has a heavy hand in Sopranos and in Mad Men.
This is the first Mad Men episode. I don't know if we get another one like this where it's directed by Phil Abraham and written by Matthew Weiner. We might get that at some point later. I'd have to double check. But at the very least, if we do, I think it's one of the many situations where Matthew Weiner co-writes. We don't have a ton of episodes of Mad Men where Matthew Weiner writes by himself. Actually, I'm going to take a look because I have a feeling there is one more episode like that, but I want to fact check it first. In the meantime, yes, this is another Matthew Weiner episode. He has not been the sole credited writer of a Mad Men episode since the first episode of this season, I want to say, which was For Those Who Think Young. He also directed. He also wrote several episodes of last season by himself, but for more in the first half of the season, the pilot, obviously, and then the episode right after, and then he did 5G. So we're getting to the point in the show where Matthew Weiner is writing less and less solely, and he's more putting a lot of other writers in the room with him. We're going to see that even more going through the rest of the series, because I wonder if I remember correctly, the season 3 is one of the seasons where he barely writes, especially by himself. But all that said, I love seeing Matthew Weiner as the writer here every time he shows up in the credits, because it's his show. And he always has such a particular stamp on the series. And okay, I just brought it up, and he does have one more sole writing credit on this season, and that is the Jet Set, which is episode 11. And Jet Set is an interesting one to be sure. But anyway, Maidenform. Will, would it surprise you to learn, I don't know if you might have noticed this if you were reading up on the episode after you watched it, would it surprise you to know that this is certainly one of the more controversial Mad Men episodes among fans? Some people really, really, really love it and consider it one of their favorites. Some people do not. And Matthew Weiner himself has said this is his favorite episode of the series.
Of the series?
Yes.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah. But you sound surprised.
I mean,
but it is contentious because there are a lot of people who are like, you know what, this is not one of the better episodes. People have issues with this episode.
Did he detail why he considers this one his favorite? Or is he just kind of like, it's my favorite just because?
If I remember right, so he said this in an interview, and if I recall, it has a lot to do with the way that he was able to tie everybody's stories together. He's really proud of, and a lot of the symbolism in here, he thinks sum up a lot of the series. I think one of Matthew Weiner's favorite things to do with writing in general, but especially with this show, is taking characters who are unsympathetic, characters who are just, it's so easy to see them like Pete Campbell, and kind of peel back the layers of who they are and really dig deeper into what would make them sort of human, and he loves taking characters that are kind of archetypal at first glance, and then having the audience kind of just continuously question and reevaluate who these characters are. And I think he really likes this episode because there are all of those moments where a character will literally just look in the mirror and be asking themselves that question of who am I really? It's that kind of thing that I think he puts a lot of care and attention into this episode in particular. And I think it's quite well done. But yeah, I think that basically sums it up.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think in a broad sense, this episode really tackles a lot of things that from where I stand, at least as a newbie to the series, that he likes to really explore, which is these ideas of as you're mentioning, characters trying to define themselves in society, kind of figuring out what roles they play, how they can fit into those roles, who they are as these people. Like, can they really be this one thing or the other, especially in terms of how their work life defines their personal lives. And I think that is kind of a brilliant touch with this episode, where it takes place primarily on Memorial Day, which is supposed to be a day that everyone's supposed to be off. And we've seen before where like their personal lives and their work lives have been kind of intersecting. Certainly that one episode earlier this season where everyone's in their like Labor Day attire, not Labor Day, I forget. Is it like their kind of summery attire? Memorial Day. Okay. Wait, I thought this was Memorial Day. Did I get mixed up?
Oh, you're talking about the other episode.
Okay.
When they were on like, it was like 3 Sundays.
Yeah. Okay.
It was like Easter.
Okay. That's Easter. Okay. Yeah, that's right. So this is Memorial Day.
Yes.
Yeah. I was going to say, because that's the whole reason why they have that tribute to the veterans at the country club.
Right, exactly.
But yeah, no, I just like that. It doesn't really tackle these ideas in a new way compared to like what we have seen from the show already. But I think from my standpoint, it is done in a fairly neat way, but also not skirting past the complexities of the characters and allowing some to be sympathetic and unsympathetic and like just a scene by scene basis, and really kind of getting into the nitty gritty of who these characters are while letting them feel fleshed out and difficult, but also compelling and nuanced. So I think I can sympathize with why he puts this one so high on his own ranking, but I wouldn't say it's a personal favorite of mine.
Yeah, it's not a personal favorite of mine, but I will say I appreciate it now more than I ever have. It was one of those episodes where I never gave it that much attention because it's the kind of Mad Men episode where it's mostly a lot of inconsequential or seemingly inconsequential moments that are strung together. And it's really just built on character. It's not really built on plot, because the plot here, ultimately, it's almost purposefully anticlimactic. Right, there's the big Maidenform, or not Maidenform pitch, but Playtex pitch that is obviously trying to mirror Maidenform, and that doesn't really go anywhere. It's sort of like, oh, it's not rejected or accepted. It's just sort of like, oh yeah, we decide we're not going to do it anyway. It's very anticlimactic, right? That sums up a lot of this episode. Well, a lot of things just happen, but there isn't a lot of, and now things are different. It's almost episodic. In that way.
But also, I mean, just by the nature of it being about a brazier, it's kind of tying into the idea that like this very private thing is becoming public, or this idea that like something that's meant to be very intimate and very personal is their business. And then also,
that's why the Maidenform campaign, which is a real ad campaign, was built upon dreams and imagination, because it was taking this private thing, this sort of like, we don't really talk about braziers. There's even that moment where Freddie Rumsen is sort of like, we're going to need another box of braziers, like right in front of Duck's kids. There's that whole moment. The dream and imagination of that concept is what made that ad campaign so successful, because it was such a new, novel, way to approach that type of thing.
Yeah. So I don't know. I thought that was a clever touch, something that I can certainly admire from this episode.
Yeah. I can always tell an episode of Mad Men kind of has my brain really working when I have a ton of notes on the episode. And I really like some episodes where I don't have a lot of notes. I'm just really like so immersed in, I'm not thinking to take notes. This is a different one. This is one where I'm constantly watching it. And as usual, I watched it twice. And the second time, I'm pausing it constantly because I'm just like, there's that too. There's that too. So you mentioned the nitty gritty. Let's get into the nitty gritty of the episode. So ultimately, I think this is an episode that's about, at least it kicks off, being about how men see women. There's a lot in this episode of like the Freudian concept of, men seeing women as either a Madonna or a whore. I think whore was like the term he used, but this idea of like a saint or a mother, a Jackie Kennedy, somebody who's more, prim and proper, elegant, grace, and then somebody who's a little bit more fun and flirty and, like Marilyn Monroe. And this episode is kind of like the fantasy of men wanting women to essentially be both. And as we watch this episode unfold, we see that ultimately somebody like Don Draper tries to separate the two. And I've never noticed this until watching this episode now, because we pause and we talk about it every week. I'm starting to put a couple things together that I hadn't before, which is that I think this episode really is getting at Don being Don and Pete and Duck essentially being three men who they themselves can be separated into the two flavors. And I think that episode is more about like, it's not about women being Jackie or Marilyn. It's about men being one of two different things. And I think the episode's getting at how Don and Pete essentially are like, I don't want to say Jackie and Marilyn, but it's going back to the Nixon Kennedy thing here. There's even some like references, right, to the Kennedy himself, the Bay of Pigs. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, not only in terms of referencing the Bay of Pigs, but the ad campaign is essentially putting anyone that watches the ad in the role of Kennedy, because obviously, you know, not only is he married to Jackie Kennedy, but he had the famous affair with Marilyn Monroe. So it's the idea of like, you know, sort of objectifying women in the eyes of Kennedy. And being like, you can be like the kind of Kennedy and admire, you know, not putting women's agency in front, but rather like, you know, viewing each woman as like one of two lovers in the president's life.
Yes, exactly. He is being a Nixon when he gets all Puritan with Betty. When he tries to discipline Betty as like, you're the mother of my children. You are not Marilyn. You know, don't wear that skimpy swimsuit. He's being a Nixon, right? Instead of a Kennedy. And there's something to be said, too, of like the season has referenced at least once, if not multiple times, the idea of Kennedy chasing women, you know, specifically Kennedy, you know, having not just Jackie, his wife, but also like alleged affairs with Marilyn Monroe, that sort of thing, right? So again, it's one of those things where it's kind of like you said, when you're watching the episode, it's sort of like, huh, that's interesting. But then it's like, once you've watched it like afterward and you start to like really think about it, and then of course, like maybe look into what other people have to say, it all kind of starts to click into place. And there's so much to admire there of what Weiner is doing. Yeah.
And then also, I mean, the idea of like, something I find fascinating here, especially for a show that's taking place very crucially in this time in the early 60s, is looking at the Kennedy campaign in terms of like, he kind of sold this bill of goods as far as like, he's going to change things up and radicalize it. And then, like you said, there's a Bay of Pigs incident, and that's like kind of like one of his biggest like follies in the presidential campaign, and something where he wasn't really able, like he kind of feels that he's like failing to live up to his personal promises. And that's kind of a fascinating thing to explore at this point in the series, I think.
You know what's funny though? History shows us that when that happened, Kennedy's approval went up. And I think this episode also alludes to that a little bit as well, when Don sort of says everybody's happy. And I mean, part of that was because people were very anti-communist. They were very anti-Fidel Castro. And so it wasn't the kind of thing that would sink JFK. But there are a lot of historians who say that if it wasn't for Kennedy's assassination, there probably would have been a lot more backlash to his presidency that he never really received in the decades following, right? Like, were people really being honest about the Bay of Pigs situation, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how all those situations went down? A lot of it sort of gets overlooked or diminished or downplayed, I should say, because ultimately he was assassinated and people remember that.
Yeah, I was gonna say it because
spoilers for
spoilers for real life, and I'm sure spoilers for Mad Men too. I have to imagine they're going to discuss the Kennedy assassination at some point. So spoilers if you didn't know about that and you're watching a show new like me. But in any case, I was gonna say, because I do think that when we look at the Kennedy presidency, it is kind of romanticized and turned deeply tragic, obviously, because of the assassination. But yeah, just that's what I mean. I appreciate that it's able to kind of look at the messiness of the Kennedy campaign at this very specific time and feel appropriate in a way that something that I think is very true to Mad Men, which is like, it can be nostalgic, but also just have a hardened look at what this time was and just kind of, you know, rationalize that as the characters are living it at this moment and in this time.
Totally agree. There's another running thing through this episode where multiple times we see men seeing women and viewing them a certain way, viewing them as like a sexual object of desire, right? Arthur sees Betty at the country club and, you know, goes on to flirt with her. Later, Don, you know, is trying to get it on with Bobby, you know, over the phone. But then the mention of children comes up, right? The kids literally run up to Betty and are like, mommy, mommy. And then Arthur noticeably looks extremely uncomfortable because at this point he notices that she has kids. And there's the running thing where Don is unable to really like combine the two, look at Betty as somebody who is someone he can have this romantic, like get his like romantic, frustrations out on that he's been having. He can do that with her. She wants to be that for him, but he just sees her as the mother of his kids. It's a toxic thing that he's carried on since season 1. We've watched, right, where he constantly is like looking at her not as somebody who is fun, somebody who is his equal, somebody who can challenge him. He just constantly sees her. He says that thing to her, right, in that one episode where he's like, I wish I could have had a mother as great as you, right? In the episode Shoot. And that's something that obviously rankles Betty because she's like, I'm more than a mother. I'm more than a housewife. And I think that's part of why it's surprising to Arthur that she has kids. She doesn't talk about her kids, right? At the horse club stuff. Like she mentions the kids to like that lady, but Sarah Beth Carson, but she doesn't, you know what I mean? Like when she goes there, she's not a mother. She's suddenly like living this vicarious life of, being single in her 20s again, right? So I just find it all so fascinating. I think at this point she might be 30 or about to be 30. But
no, I think she's still in her 20s, or at least like she's like around my age, right?
She's 28 in season 1, okay, which is like the spring.
Yeah.
And then, so that means she would have been 29 in season 2. I think she's like just turned 30 in the show's time.
Okay.
Because we're in Memorial Day, so we're at the end of spring.
Gotcha.
So my best guess is that she's 30, but like newly 30.
But yeah, no, I definitely agree in the sense that like, obviously with the whole Brazier campaign, they're, obviously selling women as like an object of desire, and they're sexualizing them and choosing deliberately to not look at the complexities of their lives. And certainly the show is trying to, like, with all the main female characters that become the focus here, choosing to show like how they have these like complexities that men actively avoid or feel sort of disgusted by, certainly with like Arthur, not wanting to see, like you said, Betty as a mother and someone who has a life outside of the horse ranch. But also, yeah, like we see later with Bobby, where she has 2 kids, like 2 adult children, like early adult
she brings
children.
it up.
Yeah.
Don is immediately like, well, there goes my boner.
Well, I mean, it's a little twofold there, yeah, because it's not only that, but then the fact that he can't really have power over the relationship because
right,
he's hearing, I don't know if it's true for or not from Bobby, or if I don't know if she's doing that and saying that to kind of inflate his ego, or if it's actually sincere. But yeah, like she's saying that like he has this sort of reputation, this image that's being created outside of his control.
Well, she has to be sincere, right? Because she mentions Sarah Tierney from Random House. And immediately when she says that, Dawn is like, oh, she's serious.
Yep.
Like, yeah, because she wouldn't have known that otherwise. And it also explains earlier in the season, like, why she was so actively pursuing him. They have their little, like, dalliance, right, in the car, but she's kind of not content with that, right? She made the first move, by the way. But then, of course, like, she's the one who's going to his office. She's the one who's sort of like actively pursuing him, calling him and trying to get the affair going. Things have shifted at this point where he's the one who's calling her at the country club. And I was going to ask you this because there's a whole thing in the country club, right, where my first glance of the episode, my thinking is that the reason he wants to jump into bed with Bobby after all that stuff is because of he's in the fashion, not before the fashion show thing starts. He's like standing up. The guys, like many of whom will not be enjoying ribs tonight. What a line of dialogue. I have to assume you enjoyed that moment.
I thought his whole character in general was pretty fun, at least for the short time we saw him.
Lester, a rough rider.
Yeah, rough rider. Yeah, geez Louise.
I love the delivery of his lines, yeah. But no, like Don stands up and then Sally is clapping and everything. And he looks so uncomfortable because just like the way that he sees Betty is, as somebody who's not a mother, he sees himself as like, oh, I'm not Don. I'm Dick Whitman. The whole situation reminds him of that. And it's something that pierces him. And I think my first glance at the episode is like, I'm always thinking the reason he wants to go have sex with Bobby at that point is because he wants to go be Dick Whitman. I'm kind of wondering, though, if I'm overthinking it and if it really is more a matter of like, because the fashion show is happening and you kind of get the sense, right, who's like, I'm going to go. And then Betty's like, I would have thought you would want to, be here for this because you're a guy and like ladies in their underwear, like for the 60s, like that's not, you don't see that every day. And I always just thought he was uninterested, but I wonder, maybe you agree or disagree, but I wonder if it was more of just like, he's just a red-blooded American male, right? As Pete said in the last episode, he just sees that and he's like, all right, I'm turned on, I'm aroused, I think it's maybe the episode subtly saying it's not that he's unattracted to Betty when she has those clothes on, he just doesn't view her in that context, but he sees that in the fashion show and is immediately like, I want to have sex now, so I'm going to go have sex with Bobby. But then, of course, she's unavailable, so he goes home. My thinking is that he essentially pleasures himself for that reason, or he's just frustrated. But I mean, it doesn't give you any clear indication either way. Do you think I'm completely off base here, though? This is just like a news sort of.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if this was close to reasonable.
I can't say I know for sure. I mean, there was a part of me that was wondering if like seeing the underwear fashion show hit close to home, not only after the veteran presentation, but because he's thinking about work and thinking about how like that kind of relates to his struggle with Dawn and Dick, and that he like kind of got very close to losing that control, and like just I don't know, like I said, like there's a sort of inability with this character and a lot of characters in this episode to kind of separate their home lives and their work lives. And if I didn't know if that was like a moment where things kind of conflated emotionally for him in a way that he wasn't really equipped to handle at such a sensitive and kind of vulnerable moment for him. But that might be me reading too much into it.
That's the thing I do like about this episode is like you can kind of take different approaches, and I think like in a way they can all be sort of valid in their own ways almost. So obviously I think that moment too, like when he's alone, kind of like looking out, not sure what to think, and that moment when Sally is like clapping and like looking at him with admiration, it's a very important moment because obviously it goes into what happens at the end of the episode, which is a real gut punch, right? He just suddenly starts to have like what looks like an almost panic attack. And there's a lot we could read into that. Before we get to the end of the episode, though, we haven't even talked about the very beginning, which this is one of those few times where we kind of get a big anachronism in the show, which is they play a Decemberist song, the Infanta, which is a modern song. And I've always found it very striking. It kind of takes you by surprise. It's kind of the same idea, same kind of opening scene montage as what we had at the beginning of the season, although that was the twist, the second version of the twist by let's do the twist again like we did last summer, that whole thing. And but this time, and it's just Peggy, Joan, and Betty, right, putting on their undergarments and everything. What did you think of this choice, this artistic choice to do a modern song? I mean, I tried to look into the reasoning for this, and it just looks like Matthew Weiner just liked the song and wanted to play it. Well, but that's of course what he's going to say in an interview.
Yeah, I mean, it's a Decemberist song. I don't know how you feel about the Decemberist.
I was a fan back like around this time, sure. 2008 to 2011. Like that was kind of their peak.
Why do you say
I kind of moved from Decemberist to like Avett Brothers a little bit, and then fell off.
I got you. I don't know. I do like Decemberist fine. I can't say I'm a super fan or anything, but I do appreciate that with this song, which is Infantasia, right? I believe that's the song they picked, or Infanta.
The Infanta.
Infanta, yeah.
The Infanta, yeah.
I mean, it's deliberately meant to be that kind of jarring counterbalance where not only in the sense that it's a song from 2005 being played in this 1962-1963 setting, but the song itself is kind of meant to be progressive in style, but the lyrics itself are kind of old-fashioned and talking about this very, old-fashioned story, and it's intentionally sort of anachronistic in that way, in the sense of like not only is a song sort of anachronistic by design, but it's just being placed in this time, and so it has that kind of weird, like, I don't know, it reminds me a bit of like in like Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette, when they play like Gang of Four at the beginning, and it's like this very old-fashioned setting, but it has a very
one of my favorite movies, A Knight's Tale.
Sure.
Playing all kinds of anachronistic music. It's fun. It's atmospheric. It's a device that, and I know Matt Zoller Seitz touched upon a lot of what you're saying in the book Mad Men Carousel. I also think Noel Murray touched upon this in his AV Club interview, where it's like it helps take you to the past while keeping your head rooted in the future. Because then when you're watching everybody put the underwear on and the constrictions and everything, it reminds, and you're hearing a modern song, it immediately gets you thinking out of the immersion and being like, women today don't really have to do the same things, like have that same like level of like expectation as they used to. And it's notable too that it ends with Peggy putting on pantyhose, which was a very new thing at that time.
Yeah.
And certainly had a different context.
But not only that, but the brassiere that they're advertising, she's wearing as well. Like it's literally on her body. And it seems to be her brassiere of choice. And yet, obviously throughout this whole episode, not only Peggy but Joan don't really get consulted or even like invited into a lot of like the major discussions about this thing. Joan obviously is just kind of ogled throughout, like just obviously like she's a well-endowed woman, and
she even says to Peggy, you're in their country
right
now, I'm not part of that. Like there's such a clear separation.
But even at one point, like, doesn't she say something like kind of quippy, just like, if another man asked me about my boobs again or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, so she just kind of is seen as like this, office sex symbol, not really valued for the intelligence she clearly has or what experience she could bring into this. But then subsequently, like Peggy's basically begging to like offer some input, not only as, a fledgling copywriter trying to lay her stake in this company, but just like because she has the knowledge that they need for how to sell the clothing that she is literally wearing, and yet the men around her don't want to contribute. But I don't want to jump ahead from the song discussion. I was going to mention that another kind of famous filmmaker to do that pretty often in his film is obviously Quentin Tarantino. And I feel like one of the more famous examples is in like Inglourious Bastards, where you have this like kind of, more modern song counterbalance against like his past time, and seeing like how that's going to like, without giving too much away, if anyone listening hasn't seen that film, like how that kind of informs how the film's going to take a path different to what history took, and have kind of a more modern confrontation with what was happening at this time. And I look at it in that kind of way, as if like, it's like, it is a little jarring at first, especially for a show like Mad Men that is so often very careful about the details and in keeping everything time and period sensitive. But I don't know. I think, given what they're doing here and how it's intentionally supposed to be jarring, it ultimately fits.
Right. And I think that's totally true, because I think at this point, after how many episodes of Mad Men, I think almost 20 at this point, the show has earned credibility. It's earned that level of, it knows what it's doing, and it knows, of course, it's using a modern song. That's as obvious as it gets. And people are in that zone where they're not going to question it too much. They're instead going to sit back and be like, of course there is a reason for this. Let's think about it. And so, I think the show has earned that chance to be a little risky, a little risky and frisky.
And Weiner has earned that trust, as you were saying, like not only, in terms of the show, but him as a creator. Like, it's not like the audience isn't thinking like, oh, this song's super inappropriate for this time. They're thinking, oh, like very interesting choice. Why did you do that, Mr. Weiner? And that's, a credit to what he has been able to do in just a matter of a season and a half at this point.
Right on. And I'm glad you did mention the big Peggy plot of this episode, because I was going to bring up as well that both Peggy and Duck, but Peggy even more so, are often shot like as totally isolated in this episode, because I think a big thing with both of these characters is that they feel excluded. They feel like they're not really part of Sterling Cooper the way that they want to be. In Peggy's case, it's like we've been saying, she very much just doesn't feel like she's one of the boys. And people have been telling her, by people I mean Bobby and Joan, that, you got to be a woman. Like, if you try to be a guy, like Freddie even says right at the beginning, like, Peggy's just the man to do it, and it's sort of echoing that's been her approach, is to be a guy, or to take that on, and that's how she's going to get respect around there. But clearly, her femininity is an asset. It's something that she can use, and it's something she's not sure she wants to use. Even when she kind of gets her like little victory moment at the end, you see the sort of discomfort at that choice of like, was this really what I should be doing? Is this worth it? And a lot of the shots in this episode they go very far to show like she's always outside of the group. The guys are shot kind of in a bunch. She literally has the door closed in her face. I mean, it's very, very intentional. You can tell that Phil Abraham is a director of photography at heart. When he directs things, he's always thinking about visual metaphors. Some people would criticize it and be like, oh my gosh, it's a little bit too blunt. But in this case, I think it's well deserved, because it is such an important fabric to the story. Duck's is even more pronounced in some ways, because one of the first things he says to Don in their like little fake lunch meeting is that he just feels like he's not getting into the swing of things, you know. And Don's like 18 months in, you know, it's like we can't be that unusual. And like you really get the sense that like Duck's insecurity, that's his big flaw, right? He feels extremely insecure. He feels like nobody accepts him, wants him to be there, that he, you know, has this dark past he doesn't want to keep being reminded of. People shit on him all the time. I mean, his kids, Will Ashton, his kids are just flat out mean to him. And they just, rightfully so. I think you and I are not Duck fans, but Duck gets a lot of shit in this episode.
I don't really have any strong or super strong negative feelings towards Duck. I'm kind of more neutral at this point. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's not like
he's one of the most reviled characters in all of Mad Men.
Really?
Because of what he does to Chauncey.
Okay.
It's truly one of the most.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't want to get too far ahead, but that is a real downer of a moment, to say the least.
Literally getting rid of his dog who, you know, the name is very clear. Like he had this dog in London. London is like where he had his wife, where his family was together, and they're still there. And the idea that like, yeah, he doesn't want to have his dog back. He doesn't want that reminder. He doesn't want, I mean, part of it is that he's just extremely selfish. He doesn't want to take care of anything.
Yeah.
But I think, as well, like he also just doesn't want this like remnant from his past just constantly staring at him, because when he wants to, you know, dive back into, you know, alcohol, the dog is what stops him, because it reminds him of like what he went through. Yeah. Right. And so that's why he feels like he has to get rid of the dog so he can go back up there and drink, which is my takeaway from that shot. But it isn't overly explicit. You could read it a certain way of like, oh, maybe he didn't drink, but I think he did.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, and as you were kind of alluding to, the dog represents this, you know, the fact that like many characters in the show, like he can't really separate his home and work life. Like his peers are always kind of looking at him through his biggest sin, which was this affair that's often mentioned but not really discussed in detail that happened before he came on to Sterling Cooper. And yeah, and like the fact that like he has this kind of dog that is, you know, metaphorically just kind of following him around, just, you know, always kind of serving as like this, you know, physical reminder of what he can't escape. And then you have that funny scene with him and Pete, where Pete like kind of he just wants to be so badly, he wants to be like a man and have that kind of like mystique and that sort of like authority in the office. And he's just like a true psychopath is just like, yeah, I think I should get a dog, or I should bring my dog in. And he's like, oh, like what kind of dog do you have? Like he's like, oh, I don't have a dog. It would just be for the work. He's like, all right, well, good luck with that, Pete.
He's like, I don't think that's a good idea. It's like such a great moment.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I really appreciated as a dog man myself having the dog around the office. I think they didn't do enough with Chauncey in this episode. Personally, I thought there should have been like an Airbud kind of thing going on where you know,
he does a pitch.
Well, no, I was gonna say
he sells Maidenform.
Well, I was thinking like, you know, as the episode progresses, you like see he gets little glasses. He has like a suit. He has a little like glass, and then they're like
cigarette.
Yeah, Chauncey is just like, you know, like getting ready to pitch.
Dog goes into Roger's office, and Chauncey and Roger,
and then they're all this like, yeah, and it's like, well, I don't know if the dog can give a pitch, and they say, of course, you know, there's nothing in the rule book that says the dog can't pitch to the client. It goes over great. He becomes, you know, the new head of accounts. Duck is beside himself. Yeah.
The Duck gets rid of the dog. No, that's what should have happened after he tried to abandon the dog. The dog ends up roaming Madison Avenue and getting a job at McCann.
Yeah, exactly. That would have been, that's my headcanon actually, is what happened, is that the dog didn't like go astray and have this really tragic life. It actually went and bettered itself as it went along and became you know, Duck's rival, which is fitting.
Just like Duck's ex-wife just went on and found a better family.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But seriously though, his kids, I mean, the moment where he's just like, man, it can be really tough, huh? Like not having your dad around, and his daughter's just like, we don't care. And I love them. They're just so like, they're of that age, right? Where they're just, you know, they're going to be the meanest people on the planet, as John Mulaney would say. But there's also that great delivery that his son has, where he's just like, I have money. I have $150. And I just, I love Mad Men. It's just like it doesn't mean anything, but it's just like a little. I can just see like Matthew Weiner and Phil Abraham just being like, no. You really need to sell this line. You need to say this line like you have not $150. You have $25,000. Like that's like the zone, the pitch that you need to hit right now. And sure enough.
Yeah, indeed.
There's a lot of good stuff in here. There's Betty's whole just like, oh, it'd be like college, let's be friends. I liked how Arthur was like, I didn't know you belonged here. That whole country club wasp thing always rankles me.
Yeah, I was going to mention that before. I feel like that kind of adds to Don's discomfort, is that he comes from, a very, poor background. And, country clubs are literally something you have to get invited into. Even, someone of privilege like Don and Betty are now. He's like, it's something that he feels like his status therein is always going to kind of be in question, always in trouble. And I feel like that kind of adds to his general discomfort, not only with being at the country club, but watching that display with the underwear show.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I wanted to mention this too. We kind of skipped past this, but there's the whole thing where Peggy sells Clearasil, that ad, to Pete. And, it's obviously like, we're seeing that like Peggy is really good at this. Like she's just showing some like natural raw talent of recognizing the benefit and noticing the problem, how limited they are with like the creative that they have when Pete shows her the picture. And she just comes up with this great idea, like right off the spot, of like, it could be like a date. And like, it just seems like she's been really working hard at this. And it's a great way to start her arc of this episode, because then it's tragic to see like how she continues to be excluded, even though she has all this talent. And she, of course, has Paul as a rival because he obviously has the Playtex idea that Don really likes. But at least in this moment, I like how there are two moments actually where she seems to show, or at least impress Sal. Sal really seems to recognize it. Like when she's doing that, Sal's just kind of like, yeah, like he's kind of like into it. Like I think he recognizes it as an art director. And there's the scene later where they're kind of making fun of Peggy and calling her Gertrude Stein, and he sticks up for her, right? In front of everybody. He takes that risk. And I think it's because Sal recognizes that like, fuck all you guys. Like she rules. Like Team Peggy Olsen over here in the Sal land. Obviously, he's not like a total friend, but I don't know. I like that there is that nice little subtle touch. Is it something you noticed at all? Because I don't know if it's something I ever noticed before necessarily, but yeah.
I always take special notice of Sal because he's my favorite character on the show. But no,
you heard it here first, folks.
I'm sure I've said that before already. But yeah, I mean, yeah.
I don't know if you said it so full-throatedly. Like I think you said like, I really like. I don't know if you said he's definitively your favorite.
He's my favorite. I like Sal. I hope that's a comment I don't have to rescind because of later actions with his character. I have no idea where he goes.
That's the Mad Men experience. That's the full Mad Men treatment.
Yeah,
is standing a character and then all of a sudden.
I mean, certainly you kind of, not deliberately, but, you and Mike kind of allude to like certain characters getting better or worse as the show goes along. Certainly Ken Cosgrove, for instance, is like kind of a chode in the first season, but you're always just kind of like, no. Like, Ken's all right. We vouch for him. I'm like, okay, so maybe he gets better as this goes along. And then that Paul Kinsey character, I'm always like, I don't know. He's, doesn't seem worse than the rest of them. And you're like, no. This dude sucks. Don't keep your eye on him. He's a piece of shit. And I'm like, well, I don't know. Something happens.
Well, that's more Harry Crane than Paul.
Okay.
Paul to me is like one of the more consistently like eye-rolly characters, but like
I'm not gonna lie, I get Paul and Harry kind of mixed up at this point. I'm sure there's gonna be differences and notable difference as the show goes along, but in my brain they
you'd
sometimes
think
conflate.
The beard would have helped. No Harry Crane in this episode though. Or Trudy. Trudy is in the episode. She has like that one scene where they're barbecuing at the apartment. But
yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. And I still have some things to say about Pete too, but we can discuss that in a bit. But
we can. Yeah, I mean, in this scene, he's like thanks, Clearasil. I think that was a real ad campaign, or I think I remember learning about that. So I think that's what they're drawing from. But yeah, that's a whole thing.
Yeah,
where Pete is sort of like play with it. He pitches the line. He kind of does the Bethlehem Steel thing again, and it's kind of interesting how Peggy doesn't fight him. She's just sort of like, yeah, that's great. Yeah, sure. I'll think about it. Yeah, whatever. Like she just, I think, shows here a virtue or sort of like a tactic that Don has, because Don does the same sort of thing with Duck. he has a moment in this episode where he could tell Duck to go to hell, because he even sets it up, right, where he's just like, you pitch more to me than you do to clients. And then he gets another I told you so, as Duck would say, when Playtex is sort of like, we don't need to do this anyway, and they wasted all their time. But Don doesn't lash out at Duck. He's just sort of like, hey, as long as the client is happy. And I think it's very purposeful that Peggy has that same mindset, because we're continuously seeing like she is like sort of a Don Draper in the making, if you would agree.
Well, yeah, undeniably so. I mean, the fact that this whole season has like paralleled them throughout, I think makes that pretty evident.
But yeah, you said you had stuff to say about Pete.
Well,
I don't want you to hold back. You know? I mean, he was his own shitty self in this episode, for sure.
I mean, I kind of mentioned it in part already, but yeah, he's still trying to be like kind of the big man on campus, trying to assert himself as a man. He's still a boy among men, but he wants to be kind of respected as such. And
he's the one who doesn't want to separate work and family, right?
Yeah, even so far as having that affair with the would-be model, the woman that auditioned and didn't get the part. But yeah, but there's that moment where she also kind of has her own secret, which is that she's like living with her mother. Her mother lives with her or something. I'm not exactly sure which, but it's for a moment. I mean, I guess Pete kind of gets over it, but it's like kind of a turn off for him as well. And I think Matt Zollers kind of alludes to it being the fact that he like kind of withheld, or she withheld this kind of information from him because she was kind of put on his own facade. She wants to present herself as this kind of more independent, forthright person. But I don't know. I think it's a little bit deeper than that. I think it kind of ties back into, again, Pete wants to be a man. He doesn't want to be a boy. And he kind of sees, when she's living with her mother, it's kind of like this like teenage romance where they kind of have to hide from the parents and do this thing in secret. And I feel like that kind of ties into like, he wants to be a man, do something irresponsible and kind of dirty and like have this affair, but he's still just acting out like a child and he can't really escape that.
Yeah, I think the genius of the Pete Campbell character is that he's the kind of person that we all know in our lives who is going to be whoever the world tells him that he's supposed to be. He doesn't have his own beliefs. He doesn't have his own sort of guiding morality. He is a product of nurture. He's sort of the anti-nature kind of character. Most people are mixtures of the two. They're nature and nurture, right? With Pete, his nature is more sort of like, I am who the world says I'm supposed to be. And his frustration, his pettiness, all the ways that he lashes out, it's all a result from him growing up and being told this, and this about masculinity, about what's expected of him in business and manhood and all of that. And him just constantly seeing that he can't do it and sort of hitting a brick wall, over and over again, which is why I think that when he looks into the mirror, he smiles. Because it doesn't matter to him that it's not real, that he's not really a man. It looks like it is. And to him, it's like he is able to sort of even have like a semblance of that experience. That's all he needs to be like content. And I think that it's a very brilliant move, because I just think that, and we talked about this a bunch, people continuously, I think, misunderstand his character and try to put him as like sociopathic. And I don't think it's at all. It seems that way. But we know people in our lives who are like this, who, may have like political beliefs, right? Be extremely like, you think they're like very progressive, or maybe you think they're very conservative, whatever it is. But like, if you just kind of change their circumstances a little bit, their beliefs and the way they approach the world completely changes. Like as soon as it becomes convenient for them, because they don't really believe anything. They just kind of like ride whatever wave they're on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, he's just, to put it in modern terms, he's just unfortunately a little too cringe, which is something I think you've said earlier today in private you sort of sympathize with, not with Pete Campbell, but the idea of cringe. But yeah, I don't know. He's just, he's someone who just can't really buy his way into one thing he wants, which is respect. And he feels like he's entitled to the sort of thing that he just can't have, at least at this point in his life and his career. But he's, it's rather than like feel like reflection or like take it in stride, he's like indignant and sort of petty and jealous of it. And yeah, and now that kind of bleeds into his complicated relationship with Peggy, and how like now she's kind of putting herself in this position where she can be admired and kind of ogled by men in the office and kind of use her femininity to assert herself. But yeah, he just kind of he's not taking that too well.
I think that's, you know what, we talked about this, right? Last season, we talked about how in a lot of ways, Don isn't either Don or Dick at a given time. He tends to be a mix of both of them. And I think that's what he sees in Peggy, is that she has the sort of the Don Draper persona that is manufactured, that is artificial. She's able to put that on, but she's also her authentic self at the same time. She kind of like merges the two and knows when to be what she needs to be for a given situation. And, you know, we've talked about how real art, creativity comes from that honest place. You can have your outer shell, you know, you can have the sort of repressive guard up, but ultimately who you are deep down needs to exist and be cultivated, because that's where the art comes from. Pete, I think, is absolutely a 100% nothing but the shell. He's just the shell. He's constantly trying to be the Don Draper. He's just trying to inhabit something without that honesty. And that's his downfall. That's why he's not a creator. He's not an artist. He's none of that stuff. And I think that's why in some weird ways, Peggy was really attracted to him, because he represented a version of something, or something trying to be something that she is attracted to. It is symbolic. And she's, of course, growing out of that, you know, since obviously she had her heart broken by the guy, where she's sort of like, oh, you know what? There is no substance to that. And, you know, she recognizes in Don in the first episode, right? She thinks that like she can maybe sleep with Don to get ahead, but she's quickly rejected. I think she's always sort of seen from Don that 2-layer approach to being a human being in the workplace. And she's just continued to follow down that path. And Pete is not. Pete is kind of in a weird way more of a duck. But he's more of like what Duck might have been like when he was Pete's age.
Yeah, I mean, and I would even go one step further as to say that ultimately Pete is an admin heart only in the sense that he's trying to sell people on the idea of Pete Campbell. And at least at this point, he is not quite doing that successfully. I
want to mention this too. In my notes, I said that when Sally is clapping at Dawn and he's standing during like right before the fashion show thing at the country club, you'll notice that David Carbonera's theme, the Mad Men suite, is playing. And it really works because I like to think of this as like the Dick music. It plays a lot when Don is like reflecting on his Dick Whitman persona. Especially like in 5G, it plays a lot in that episode. So I thought that was a nice little musical touch. You know, certainly when you watch the show enough, it becomes one of those things that sticks out more and more.
Does that music return for the mirror scene at the end?
I don't think the same part of the song does. No, but okay. I'd have to rewatch. I think it's a different part of the Mad Men suite, but I don't want to say that.
I don't know. That wasn't a leading question. That was an honest question.
Well, that's the thing. It's like, I don't even know if he's really a dick in that moment, if, you know, pardon the pun. I was also curious because Pete and Trudy and Bud and his wife, they're not at the country club. They're kind of like barbecuing at home. And I had this fleeting thought. I was like, I wonder if that has to do with like, you know, them not being as flush as they used to be, or like the stuff with their dad maybe being a reason why they don't have like a country club sort of thing. They talk about things they can do maybe for appearances, but I don't know. I kind of had that fleeting thought. Maybe it's not, maybe I'm overthinking it. But there was even the part where he's talking to Peggy the next day and he's kind of like, oh, we just kind of hung around or whatever. He's more interested in what she did, I guess. Not really, but you know, then he spoils Liberty Vance for her and all that. So yeah, he spoiled it for me too. I haven't seen that movie.
I haven't seen it either. So, you know, he spoiled 3 people today.
What a jerk.
Yeah, there you go. But yeah, I was going to ask you about that Liberty Vance. I was also going to inquire about, like, do you think it's deliberate that Duck also has a son and a daughter in the same way that Don does? And that he has this sort of dysfunctional relationship with both of them, but in a way that's like, he's actually kind of the opposite of Don, that like he wants to have that relationship, but can't. And meanwhile, like Sally's so like dotting and sincere and like wanting to be like the perfect little child for dad. And he keeps pushing her away, especially at the end there where like she, you know, is like, don't talking, you know, like knowing that she can't do that. And then like that obviously, you know, conflates where he's thinking about Bobby and just, you know, kind of caught in this, like, you know, looking at himself and realizing that he's not staring at Dick Whitman, but rather the facade of Don Draper, and having like I think Matt Zoller kind of talks about like the shaving cream kind of looks like an old man beard, and that kind of ties into his fears of aging and like this like midlife crisis he's like kind of somewhat having throughout the season. And I don't know. I think that's all compelling.
Yeah, I want to finish with that, because I want to build up to it because I think it's such a big pivotal moment.
Sure.
And one thing too, like at the country club, another thing I forgot to mention is that I think Betty realizes that he's going to go off to cheat on her because like, I think like the look on her face when she's just like, you're going to go, we haven't even like, she gets so upset. And I think it's one of those moments where it's like, yeah, she's suspicious, well past being suspicious that something is going on. And it makes sense for her to think that because like he sees a bunch of like half naked women and then suddenly he's like, I gotta go and go do a work thing. And then, there you go. So that was kind of sad. And then he just goes home and drinks milk.
Yeah.
Weirdo.
Yeah.
He should have just gone back and hung out with his kids and wife. Doesn't he love him?
Well, I mean, I do appreciate that this show, again, like there's an opportunity here, especially with the reintroduction of Arthur's character, where a lesser show I think would have been like, okay, this is a time where, Betty in a moment of, personal conflict actually has that affair with Arthur. And like that causes like, some like a love triangle or something happens. And no, she actually like is, obviously distraught, but she's like, okay, maybe if I just kind of woo him and like kind of show my sexuality with this bikini that she's sort of inappropriately wearing around her kids.
I have that in my notes as well. It does seem like a clear response from Betty, of like, that's how I'm going to get Don to like notice me. It's sad. She just wants to have sex. Mm-hmm. Don, help her.
Just wants some loving. Does she want to be more of a Jackie or a Marilyn, though?
That's the thing, isn't it?
She's kind of both.
We haven't really talked about that whole pitch, right? Where Paul, kind of is like, I had this brilliant idea. Sometimes he talks like Stewie, but he's sort of like, every girl's a Jackie or a Marilyn, obviously extremely reductive. And I mean, their ad that they do for it is so reductive to the point of like, life is black and white, right? Of like, oh, you're either this or that. It's all binary. Instead of course, no, there's in-betweens. People aren't just black and white. And then Peggy even disproves that right in the room. But, obviously it doesn't matter. That it's all about like what they can sell in an ad and not about the truth.
Well, that, and I think it's also just like I think they just want that simple pitch. They want things to be kind of simplistic in that literally black and white way. Because then, like, if it's more complicated, they have to think about it a little bit more in depth. Not only do they have to feel kind of guilt and remorse for how they look at women, but also like it's harder to kind of come up with a pitch they want to sell. And I don't know. I also think it's interesting that I think in the book, Mad Men Carousel, they point this out that, this is obviously just before the Kennedy assassination and Marilyn Monroe's suicide. And
which is the following year, right? I mean, we're still in 62. So, I mean, there's still some time before all of that happens.
Right. But then like, we see Jackie Kennedy or the model dressed as Jackie Kennedy in the black underwear, which is, supposed to, later be profound in the sense that she's kind of memorialized for wearing the black funeral dress, that year. And then later, obviously, Marilyn Monroe becomes an icon in part because of the tragedy that she died. And that is the big white billowing dress from 7 Year Inch that she wore. And so I think that's very clever and profound. Like I said, able to be nostalgic, but be present in the moment. That balance that Mad Men finds very well.
It adds to the dramatic irony, right? Of like, they're like, oh, we could come to this pitch later, like they could, right? But obviously there isn't as long of a shelf life for this creative idea as they have no reason to believe that in a year, like an ad like that doesn't work. But obviously for now, they think they're good. So Roger doesn't get a lot in this episode, but he does have a couple moments. He bums the cigarette off of Dawn, and he's like, all right, well, you and Duck need to make up. So he facilitates that. I think that he genuinely looks. I found the whole thing with Roger fascinating because I've never put a total finger on where he stands with Duck getting his job. Basically, there's never a lot of conflict with this whole thing, at least not yet. Where he's sort of like, oh, I was replaced and all that. To me, it seems like he doesn't care. He's kind of fine with somebody else taking on the responsibility because in a lot of ways, you know, he inherited the job, and you know, his name is on the building not because of him, but because of his dad. And so I think part of him is sort of like, yeah, whatever. But there is this interesting thing where he goes out of his way to try to patch things up between Duck and Don. I've always found it kind of interesting because we understand why he would want things to be good for Don to be happy. But Duck is a different story because obviously, what does he see, you know, as a value of Duck, you know, being around and everything? And I guess part of it is because like he ultimately is motivated by money. The reason he wanted American Airlines is because he wanted to bring in the money, and he likes money and all of that. But yeah, I mean, it's something to think about. I don't think this episode offers like any concrete answers to that question, but it's just, I think, building a couple of things to take note of that I'm going to be taking note of, because I wonder if there are more clues to this that I hadn't picked up on before. But yeah, I don't know if you have a theory or anything, but sure, I'd love to hear it.
I wish I did. I don't, unfortunately.
It's pretty mysterious, right? It's kind of like, yeah, there's something there. And I feel like it's coming, some kind of explanation. It's something I never really noticed or cared that much about because other stuff happens. But there might be something there, or something that they might have dropped regarding his character. Okay, so then I was also going to mention, Duck is a veteran. There's a lot of stuff with veterans in this episode. And it is kind of interesting. You know, it's Memorial Day.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's Memorial Day.
Yeah. He also mentions that he didn't want to be a fifth wheel at McCann, which I thought was also kind of interesting because I think like that's kind of where Don was headed, right? Last season when McCann was courting him. And yeah, something to take note of, that like Duck, you know, coming from Y&R and having the pedigree he did, he thinks that he could have gotten a safe job, but he wants to be at Sterling Cooper for a reason. You could read that as him just sort of like puffing himself up. Who knows? Like if he would have gotten any job, but Sterling Cooper picking him up obviously was beneficial for Sterling Cooper because despite his personal issues, his experience and everything like that was very impressive, right, on paper. But I think Don's criticism of him is so valid. That's really all we've seen with this guy. He pitches Don instead of clients, and I can see why that would frustrate Don, because it's like, what the heck, you know? Like, it's obvious that he didn't have to deal with this with Roger as much, I suppose.
Right. But then that obviously, I mean, now talking about with you, that kind of shows that Dick and Pete are sort of parallel with one another because they're both kind of trying to sell themselves to the office and sell themselves as being worthy and, you know, equals with everyone else, but they have these obvious hangups. And, you know, that kind of makes that moment with the dog with Pete a little bit funnier because it's just like, yeah, he's in a weird way almost sort of idolizing the guy that is kind of mirroring him already. And obviously mirrors play a heavy part in this episode as well.
Yeah. And I also think that Duck is the kind of person who constantly lets other people define him. You know, people call him Duck, you know, even though he doesn't want to be called Duck. You know, he has the ducks on his wall because people gave him that. And I think that's his issue, is that his insecurity is so deep that he lets other people define him. Mm-hmm. That's something Don would never do. You know, Don is always trying to control what other people think of him.
I was going to bring this up before, but did you ever notice that, I guess on the official like Mad Men wiki for the Duck Phillips page, they avoid putting Duck at all, like even as his nickname, because like how much he hates the name Duck, and it's like kind of a bit. I think it's cute.
That's funny. Yeah, let's take a look at that. I didn't know that. But yeah, anyway, we've talked about most of the rest of the stuff that happens, like Pete pitching Duck on the dog. You know, Pete fails a lot of pitches in this episode. I mean, he gets one pitch. He pitches his father-in-law on Claricel. He successfully pitches the actress, the model, to have sex with him. She's impressed, of course, like account executive, you know, all that. So he gets his little win. You know, he cheats on his wife with somebody that he's attracted to. But yeah, there's all that drama. And then yeah, this is around the part of the episode where I was like really starting to think that, you know, if women are a Jackie or a Marilyn, if you take that black and white rubric, how would you apply that to Don and Pete? Because there's that point where Don says, where he's trying to tell Duck, like, oh, what kind of breadcrumbs can you give Playtex? Don sort of supposes that maybe it's two girls. Ultimately, they go with one. But I think that there is that idea, right, of like, are Don and Pete like two people? And he sort of like defaults to, you're either one thing or the other, even though ultimately it comes down to his real philosophy is that it's one person. But I don't know. I keep coming back to this idea where Don and Pete represent that same sort of like flavor. And, you know, I think Pete obviously looks at Trudy as Jackie, and then he literally wants to have sex with Marilyn. But then you have the end of the episode where he sees Peggy and he looks pretty disappointed in what she's doing. And I've seen a lot of differing takes on this. Some people think it's because he's jealous. Some people think it's because he thought better of Peggy. Some people think it's because he's just a brat. It's just sort of like, I want attention. Like, I don't know. Where do you land on all that stuff?
Well, I mean, we talked about this at the end of season 1 that, like, if I recall correctly, Don is like a Nixon type that has like a JFK hidden inside him, or did I get backwards?
Say it again?
Like outwardly, he kind of presents himself as a Nixon, but he has that sort of like soulful
Kennedy
kind of
mentality
going inside him. Well, I was thinking like, in a way, Pete's sort of the opposite. Like he's someone who wants to kind of idealize himself as a Kennedy type, kind of fitting that role of a modern man. But he has like that kind of repressed Nixon mentality caught inside him, that kind of constricted conservative mentality of what a man is and what a man should be. And I think that kind of makes him sort of the opposite foil once again to Don here in ways that he doesn't really even fully know or can comprehend.
Yeah. You could even call this episode Jackie versus Marilyn. That would have been funny. Yeah, and I was going to mention too, the playtext pitch itself. It's like, it's so male centric, and it's just fascinating to watch, like how so much of it is built on not women, you know, because we're of course more used to modern sort of advertising and, you know, treating women as like people with agency who make their own choices, irregardless. I can't believe I said that. Regardless of what men think. I think I was going to say irrespective or something like that, but this pitch that they give is so male centric. It's all about like, oh, women are just trying to please men. And it's so removed, I think, from like what is really going through women's minds most of the time. Obviously they want to be attractive, but there is more of like, they want to be attractive because they want to be happy and it feels good to be attractive. Not just because I all I care about is making men happy. It is sort of that, you know, sentiment that those guys hold that obviously I think Peggy understands, you know, in a lot of ways. There's a reason why I think like the original pitch was something that she was a little bit more keen on, right? Because it was about her, it was about the woman of like, oh, because it fits well. You know, the fact that it's a reliable fit is a benefit to the product that rings true. It's why it makes money, because that's what women really care about. But there is something to like, oh, well, we want to be like Maidenform because, you know, they have it in their heads that like, oh, it's because women really make money or really make these purchasing decisions based on making men happy. I just think there's something really interesting about that. And I think it's really nice that the episode at least kind of moves into that like conclusion, or at least that pitch does, where they're sort of like, yeah, but that's not how we make money. And it's sort of the episode reminding the viewer of that, you know, how that works.
Indeed. Yeah, I would have to say that these characters will have to wait till the year 2000, the year of our Lord 2000, in order to figure out what women want.
Unfortunately, they'll have to learn it from somebody who probably isn't the best role model in that.
Well,
case.
I mean, he didn't. You're talking about Mel Gibson. He didn't write the film.
I know.
Or
but
direct
he's in it.
He is in it, undeniably. So I've never seen that film. Have you seen it?
Yes, I have seen What Women Want. I think we talked about it when we watched What Men Want on the Cinemaholics podcast.
Oh, I didn't see that either.
Subscribe
so
now.
I didn't review that film. I think you must have done that separately.
Yes, with Bill Action.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, I haven't
talked about him.
That's a blast from the past. Yeah.
Also, I wanted to note this, that it is interesting how we're seeing the difference in ads like starting to take shape in 1962. Because if you recall, even in this season, but also especially in 1960, the types of ads we saw, you remember like the WPA ads for Bethlehem Steel, the ads where it's like more drawn and everything, and it's not really photography. Now we're kind of seeing the more modern 60s advertising start to kind of take shape with this Playtex ad, right? Where it's a photograph and it's in black and white and it's a little bit more chic. And I think there is a reason, there is a little bit of setup to this, because what has Don Draper been doing over the last few episodes? Watching French films in black and white, and obviously like getting more rehearsed. Is that the right? Getting more versed. That's it. Getting versed in what is the cutting edge of the arts right now. Mm-hmm. He's always been kind of close to that world. Season 1, it was more the Bohemians, right? the hobo code and all that kind of showed off his connection to that community. In this season, we're seeing a little bit more of like the European sort of thing, and that sort of like chic, that sort of aesthetic. And I think there are some people who watch the show and are like, Don's lazy. He goes to the movies. And yeah, he's lazy. But I do think he's going to the movies not just because he wants to watch movies. I think he does sort of view it as like, it's good for his soul. It's good for his creative soul. And he's willing to sort of waste time in that respect.
And also there's that episode in season 1 where they talk about like how pivotal it is for these guys to be attuned to pop culture and watch TV and stuff. I think that's kind of part of it too, where he has to like, he wants to kind of adapt to like what the future of cinema is looking like, or what cinema is looking like for the present, and like how that's going to inform how art's going to be dictated in the contemporary way.
That must be why he and Harry kind of get along in that respect, because Harry told him about the glass blowing paintings and he seemed to be impressed by that. But then also he was very quick to take on Harry's idea to pitch Belle Jolie, right, on the abortion thing, because I think it's like you said, Don does have that Kennedy mentality of like new, the spirit of new, but he's in the Nixon shell. It is interesting.
One thing before I forget about this ad that I wanted to mention, since we kind of alluded to this before, is that we talk about how various characters kind of have like these two personas, like the Nixon Kennedy, or like these two identities, like Don, Dick, whatever. It's also kind of fun and fitting that like they picked one model to play both Jackie Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe, so that kind of like feeds into their ad too. Yeah.
Nice. And I love the little joke here where the guy says, "Sorry for the goose chase," right after the camera shifts away from Duck. That's just that Matthew Weiner touch, where he just doesn't care. He will make the dumbest jokes and they land perfectly. I love it.
Sure.
Yeah. And yeah, we talked about this a little bit too, where like Don doesn't lash out at Duck, and yeah, he just seems to have the mindset of like, just make the customer happy. But I did want to put it to you if you had an alternate sort of read on that. Do you think that he's just trying to be diplomatic with Duck for a different reason? Like, do you think he actually cares? Or do you think, okay, maybe he just wants to keep Roger happy. He doesn't want another awkward lunch, Maybe he's just sort of like, I'm not going to pick a battle here, right? What did you have any sort of reaction to like what that might be about?
I mean, it was his idea to bring Duck on, right? Like he kind of did that to skirt away Pete taking that role. I think there's a part of him that like, obviously he wants Duck to succeed as like a colleague and a friend, but also he's just like, I really don't want fucking Pete taking this role. I
don't think they're friends.
Yeah. I think there's a part of him just like, I kind of just need you to work. I invested in you. I put my chips in the Duck camp. I kind of just want this, this bet to pay off. And so I think there's a part of him that sympathizes with him. Obviously, like we say, he's frustrated with him and he's not really kind of pulling his weight at the moment. And it could take a turn for the worse given that he's dipping into the booze again. But
that's an interest. That's why I find it more interesting that he doesn't turn to drinking after Don lashes out at him after a conflict. He turns to drinking even though it seems like everything's fine. And I think that's way more interesting. Like that is the mark of a really good Weiner screenplay, where he knows how to subvert your expectations in that sense, because Duck is smart enough to know he's being handled. And I think that he is like being assessed. And so he turns to drinking as an escape from the cold reality that like, yeah, he's another failure. It doesn't matter what Don thinks or says or whatever. He is going to turn to that because he just feels desperate in that moment. Yeah.
And, and he shies away from the domestic life because it's like he can't really patch things up at home. So like work is all he really has. And it's kind of an empty desire for him because like unlike these other characters, he can't really conflate the two in that way because it's just basically work for him. His home life's a disaster. And so, yeah, he definitely has that yearning, that kind of emptiness that will be filled with a bottle.
Well, and then we get to the part where Peggy's still being excluded, and Ken says like, I'm going to go tell Campbell, and Peggy's standing right there, doesn't even think to go to her. And he says earlier in the episode where he's just like, oh, I won't let them do anything, or like, and this is when like the guys from Playtex are inviting them out, and he purposely excludes Peggy. And I like how Peggy finally takes the advice that Bobby gave her in the last episode that Joan reiterated in this episode. Stop dressing like a little girl. Stop trying to like be one of the guys. And so she shows up at this thing, dressed to the nines.
Yeah.
You're going to say?
Well, I was going to say also she was kind of excluded by Ken in a way. Like I think he kind of gave her more of an invitation, but she knew she wouldn't really be invited in full. It's just kind of like, well,
yes,
like you're a copywriter, so you should kind of be here, but like it's kind of a guy's thing. Like I don't know if you're going to fit in. And so that was another kind of similar thing. But sorry, keep going.
And then she shows up, she goes, and then we have a new look for Peggy Olson, and she's looking great in my opinion. That's all. But yeah, she does have that moment. She seems a little conflicted about what she's doing.
And I was going to say, and this might be a classic example of Will overthinks this, but they're going to a burlesque show where the private allure of like, seeing a woman nude or partly nude is being shown. So it's like another example of like, the private and personal are kind of intertwined. And that it's, they're paying for seeing a private yet public display.
We also have the moment where Don and Bobby are getting it on. And I was kind of curious about this since the episode plays it up so much. Is Bobby a Jackie? Is that what's going on here? Is it that Don saw her as a Marilyn, but then the whole kids thing kind of makes her a Jackie? So
I think that's exactly correct.
Okay, yeah. Because then she does the whole thing, right? She's like, I want the full Don Draper treatment. And he tells her to stop talking. He's like, I told you to stop talking, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, that gets paid off later with Sally. But then he does have that line where he's like, does it make you feel better to think I'm like you? And I think in that moment, that's when it kind of clicks for him that the Jackie Marilyn thing applies to him and that he just can't seem to accept who he is, that he is two people, that he is unable to separate the two, and that the way he sort of puts women into a box, he's in that box right now. There is something to that, like, because there's even the idea of like a man having a reputation for sleeping around. That's something that he thinks is like with women, and it's like the Freudian thing, right? The Madonna or the whore, and he's sort of like, I'm the whore, I'm the man whore, and he is sort of in that moment being like, he has to get out of there because I think it's hitting him that he's being seen that way. And I don't think maybe it clicked for him as like that or as that much in the past. So I don't know if any of that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think that the Maryland thing is kind of fascinating as far as Bobby's concerned, because it's something that came up previously when she was housebound and being watched over by Peggy. I don't know if we really talked about this, but she kind of is reading that magazine about Marilyn Monroe, and she's kind of dismissive of her and just kind of like saying like, ugh, like get it together, basically, like,
right.
And that's kind of the fascinating thing about, and the tragic thing, obviously, with Marilyn Monroe is that she was made to be idealized in this certain way, and like kind of like this perfect female embodiment of like, like the ultra sexual kind of mysterious, but in a way that's like approachable. And obviously, as has been a big talking point recently with the release of Blonde, is that like she's was obviously a deeply traumatized and harmed and emotionally fraught woman, and that her inability to kind of find comfort in men or with anybody for the most part is kind of key to what makes her story so resonant. And that with Bobby here, like she's kind of she feels this need to kind of be defined by her sexuality throughout. That was another kind of talking point when she was with Peggy, is that like she's kind of feels like she has to be this sort of sexual person, even though she is more than that. She's a mother and she's a wife and she's a businesswoman and she's self-dependent in many ways, but she feels so much that her sexuality is defining, and she feels like she's kind of losing that grasp in the same way that Don is also kind of having insecurities about his age, as we see again in this episode. And yeah, it just kind of makes him, I guess in that respect, kind of peas in the pod, but also the thing that kind of pushes Dawn away from Bobby in this episode.
I almost feel bad because it's like I said, this episode, I think there's so much, and this is one of our longest episodes we've ever done. But I mean, it ties into the last part of the episode, which to what you're saying, there's the whole thing where Sally comes over and she sits down as Dawn is shaving, and she's like, hey, Daddy. And he's like, hey, you. And this is, I think, like one of the toughest scenes. I mean, he's staring in the mirror and she says that thing, right? Of like, don't worry, I won't talk. I know, she doesn't want to distract him. She doesn't want to say anything so he doesn't cut himself. And there are a lot of different ways to look at the scene, probably. For me, a lot of it is, yes, he sees his age. It's hard to get around that, the way that the beard kind of shows up. But I think there's another thing to this where he looks at Sally, and Sally is looking at him, and it's framed just like when Chauncey was staring at Duck. And it's almost like Don's been watching Mad Men. He watched the scene where Duck, was tempted to drink, but Chauncey stopped him. I'm joking, obviously. But I think this is a moment where Don realizes he's addicted. And I think he realizes that what he's addicted to is not necessarily sex, but he's addicted to what sex gives him with these other women. And when Sally smiles at him, similar to the way that Chauncey smiles, it's a reminder of the fact that he's not who he pretends to be, that he's really this person with a reputation. And I think that when he sees his daughter, it just really hits him. I think that that is what's giving him a panic attack. I don't think it's the whole he looks in the mirror and he's like, I'm Dick Whitman. I don't think it's that obtuse. I think it's way more him starting to realize that his daughter is a human being and getting older. She is starting to behave in a way that is more like an adult. And that's how he's sort of, there have been moments throughout the season where he's cultivated that for her, getting her to bring him cocktails and do all of that. And I think part of it is he doesn't really see her as an adult sometimes. And I think this is one of those moments where he does. And yeah, he can't, he can't deal with it. Noel Murray said in his AV Club review, I wrote this down, unlike the women at the start of the episode, he can't look at himself in the mirror anymore. And I think there's something really apt about that. I think there's a direct comparison between the fact that Don, doesn't have the strength to do the thing that it seems so simple. It's something that is so routine for the women at the beginning of the episode. But yeah, that is my take on that ending scene. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very deliberate to kind of bookmark this episode on these two very private moments of each character kind of getting ready about their day, and how the women just kind of it's such a hassle for the women to put on these girdles and these different, attire, but they just kind of do it. And
all guys have to do is shave.
Right. And he just can't even really get himself to do that, at least on that day. But another thing I noticed, and I kind of wanted to pick your brain about a little bit, is that I feel like this episode, more than others, is one where we see Don unclothed more often, not we see him at the towel at the end, and we see him, shirtless and unclothed with the Bobby. And it seems we so often are used to Don being kind of dressed up and, attired. And obviously when he's unclothed, it's in sort of private, intimate moments, but it's this idea of Don can't really escape himself, and that he's in his own little way, it's just naked before himself and can't really wrestle with who that is. And even in these kind of intimate moments, he's still kind of caught with the idea that he's these two things at once, but can't really nestle with either, and yet he's just that person. And so I don't know, I think that's an interesting touch. It's something I was thinking about while I was watching the episode.
Before we go to trivia, I had one last thing, and this had more to do with something else that Noel Murray said in his review that I thought was really interesting. He says, Pete's date, the model, had one of this week's most telling lines when she complained that agencies are always disappointed when they see models in the flesh after falling in love with their pictures, even though ultimately all they need is a picture. To me, that sums up what this episode is about, even more than Don's scene with Betty. And I like that a lot because, what's a mirror but a picture, And I think that it is a really nice little touch that that dialogue has. Very Mad Men thing, a very Matthew Weiner thing to almost sort of hide that in the dialogue of a secondary, tertiary character we may never see again, right? I really like that extra little detail. So, but yeah, we can go to trivia. We went pretty long on this one. Mike's going to be surprised. He's like, man, when I'm not around, y'all can't shut up. But that's how it is, I guess. But yeah, some trivia here. So as I was saying before, Matthew Weiner has said, and I should have said this before, he said that this is probably his favorite episode of the show. And I didn't say probably before, but he did say probably. Sorry.
It's okay. I won't hold it against you.
The working title for this episode was High Flight. And so that's obviously a reference to when the broadcast thing that was playing when Pete and the model were having their little tryst. It was ending the broadcast with I think, High Flight. It's like a poem that was written by a pilot from the Royal Canadian Air Force. I don't remember all the details, but yeah, very famous poem. It's like, and then I touched the face of God, all that stuff. Matthew Weiner said he almost used the Infanta by the Decemberists for the episode Shoot in season 1 when Betty is shooting the pigeons. So he waited. He had a little bit of patience, and I think it paid off here.
Yeah, I think it wouldn't have fit nearly as well in season 1. I also feel like people would probably be more critical of it if it was in season 1, because it's like, it was Mad Men wasn't quite Mad Men yet, at that time. So.
The country club scene, the indoor part of it, I guess they're always indoors, huh? That was shot in Griffith Park in Los Angeles, which is where Letters from Iwo Jima was shot. So that was interesting. Or shot in the same room.
Yeah. Good movie. Not as good as that's good. I was thinking I was going to get it confused with Flag for Our Fathers, but Letters from Iwo Jima is a better one.
Oh yeah. Very different.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't remember there being like people like bombs,
Well, I mean, they're both, Eastwood, he made them in the same year and all that, but yeah. I mean, Letters from Iwo Jima is the better of the two.
Fair enough. All right. And Chauncey, one of the breakout stars of Mad Men's spinoff show. Not a Chauncey in hell.
I mean, I was hoping the alternate title for this episode was Chauncey Hits It Big, and it's just you see him.
Chauncey's amazing breakout role upon Chauncey's day off. Yeah.
I mean, this is just a backdoor pilot for Chauncey and the spinoff that AMC was going to set up for him. If things didn't go so tragically for him.
But then Disney came out with Dog with a blog. And then,
exactly. So how can we compete with this? Chauncey doesn't have a blog. It's all that.
Anyway, so Chauncey was supposed to be in more scenes, which makes sense. They're going to do a backdoor pilot. But the production crew could not do it. So, for example, Chauncey was originally supposed to interrupt Don and Duck's meeting, which I think would have been really funny. And also thematically, it would have fit. But,
Oh, I mean, he was supposed to be in there. It was his pitch. I mean,
Well, no, the meeting where Don and Duck are like, trying to patch things up. Yeah. In the scene where Don gets upset at Betty for wearing the swimsuit, Bobby Draper, not Bobby Barrett, is walking around with a bucket on his head because it wasn't the normal actor who plays him. So they just put a bucket on the head of some other kid.
Oh yeah, no, I remember Kieran Shepka, I think, mentioned that on Andy Cohen's show that like they had like I think in total of like 8 to 12 actors playing Bobby in that one time.
Oh yeah, that's a whole thing. Just you wait. But, the Bobby Draper, musical chairs is coming up. So.
But I think she even pointed this one out as far as like there was one time where like they couldn't get, and they just put a bucket on a kid's head, and it was like a funny anecdote and stuff. But yeah, I guess that's this episode.
There was also that scene before where like they run up to Betty, like we said, and they're like, mommy, and like you'll notice that like Kiernan Shipka is like hugging her mom, and you don't see Bobby very well, but Kiernan is like kind of like staring ahead, and you can kind of tell that she's just like holding there based on the direction. And it's one of the few times that really like the show really breaks like from being a little bit more seamless. You can really see the sort of like, you can practically see like the stage, lights above the scene at that point. Cause like literally she's just standing there and she's like looking around waiting for her cue. Who would have thought she'd go on to be one of our great actors of that generation, in my opinion. But anyway, and she's good. She's good at this point too, but I think that we're still sort of getting the Sally Draper that I don't think will be remembered for the show in full effect. Although we did get premium Sally Draper content last week, if I recall.
Was that last week or the week before where she's in the office?
It was the 3 Sundays one, yeah.
I was going to say, it was a couple weeks before when she's making drinks in the office and boozing and sitting around commenting on Joan's bosoms and all that. I mean, Joan can't get a break, like she's getting comments from...
Not a great season for Joan. I mean, she got engaged, but... and then last here, the song that was playing in the strip club, the Tom Tom Club or whatever it is called How Mabel Gets Sable, Cha Cha Cha. And this was almost going to be the theme song of the show. So instead of like, Beautiful Dream, it was going to be this. And I think they made the right decision because that's obviously one of the most iconic intro songs of like modern television. So yeah, I know it doesn't measure up to for some people to woke up this morning, got myself a gun, but there you go.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
All right, well, I think that's it for this week's episode of Men.
Sure.
Good one. But yeah, I guess you kind of came away from it liking the episode, but respecting it more like in the aftermath. Certainly still like, I think it's a really, really interesting episode. It's not the most effective episode for like in the moment entertainment, but it is a thinker, and I definitely like it for that. So yeah, I can see why Matthew Weiner likes it so much.
Right. I mean, for me, I think I said it already, but it's one that I think I enjoy talking about and thinking about more than I did actually watching it. But it's not. That's not to say that it's like a bad one to watch, or that was like, they did have fun watching. I just felt like it's so much more interesting to kind of break it down thematically than to like kind of watch it play out.
Next week, we're talking about the gold violin. So definitely hang with us then. Until then, we will see you on the next flight. High flight.
High flight.